Headline, Attack of the MOOCs. New online courses are threatening traditional higher universities. We've heard so much hype in the last few years about MOOCs, about a crisis in education, and I want to provide a little bit of clarity on that right now. So what's really going on? Surely with all these high tuition increases, universities must be doing pretty well, right? But in fact, in Moody's Investor Report of 2013, it reported that 35% of universities of higher education reported a net tuition decrease, a revenue generation decrease, because although they've been raising the ticket price on university education, they've had to actually be providing more scholarships to get them to come. But we all know that universities do a lot of research too, right? You know, we receive hundreds of millions of dollars in research. But actually in the last 3 years, federal government spending on research has declined at the fastest pace since the end of the space race, since after we landed on the moon. It's decreased 20% in the last few years. So, you know, obviously this is going to impact some of the smaller universities, but I'm sure it's not that big of a deal for the Harvards and Stanfords, right? Well, endowment volatility has, ever since the financial crisis, has also moved a lot of universities to reduce their dependence on the endowments. So a lot of us wonder, well, why can't they just use the endowment? It's because if they rely on it too much in a bad year, it screws up the cash flows in their operations. With this in mind, Harvard's president, Drew Faust, said in his 2013 annual report that every revenue stream upon which institutions of higher education have traditionally rested is under pressure, and we have to adapt. Every revenue stream. Okay? And Bain Capital released a report called The Law of More, talking about that despite the biggest universities in this field talking about the pressures that they're facing, a lot of universities are still building new construction projects simply because that's the status quo, and it's making their assets very illiquid, and it's putting them into financial trouble. So what can we do? I'm not here to bring bad news. I'm here to kind of provide some encouragement and optimism, because when you look at history, you find that we've been here before. We've been here before. So before we start asking, what's this crisis and what can we do about it, we first have to agree on what is a university. And when we look at what is a university through the lens of history, we recognize that, well, it's kind of depends on the time period, and it's always been adaptive to the needs of society. So you look at the early 1600s, and the universities that started up on the East Coast, they're focused on civility, prestige, and divinity schools. And then the colonies grew, and in the 1700s, they focused on scholastic learning for the sake of learning. It wasn't even until the early 1900s, with the onset of the First World War, that the US government said, we need help, we need technology. Here's some funds. And universities built up their laboratories to provide the technology that we needed to win that war. And that obviously continued in the Second World War. They built up more laboratories. And after the Second World War, we recognized that we needed to reintegrate all these hundreds of thousands of soldiers back into our economy, and it started to focus on career training. You know, previously, before the end of the World War, the Second World War, most of education had been divinity schools, or learning, or research, and now focused on career training. The space race took off in the mid-1900s. It ended in the 1970s, so much more research funding, much more building. And guess what? At the end of the 1970s, when the space race ended, research funding dropped off precipitously, which is what we're experiencing today. And when universities are building for the sake of building, and then that goes away, many of them went bankrupt. So what did? They once again adjusted their business model and said, hey, well, we have all this research. How do we capitalize on that? All of a sudden, the offices of technology licensing focus on how can we get this technology to market and make money on that. They also focus on how can we diversify into providing medical services as another way of revenue generation. So if you think about it, it wasn't until the impetus of the end of the space race and the reduction in that grant funding that really pushed universities into action to moving our technology to market faster. So where are we today? We're in the 21st century, we're in the digital age, we're building, and research is funding off. Research funding is dropping off, tuition is declining, and what can we do? So look, we have the smartest minds, the smartest students, the smartest faculty, a bunch of great business networks at the GSB, and a lot of resources and we can find new business models. So how can we stop this law of more of higher education, of this building, and focus on transforming it to a Moore's law of providing educational outcomes? So there's a lot of things that we can do, but I'll just mention three. And three things that we can do and that we can do together. The first one is to stop excessive building. You know, we're hundreds of years past the era of building cathedrals for divinity schools, and a lot of the things where they're going right now are essentially the same, but they're paying lip service to the gods of innovation and progress. You know, no one denies that progress is good and sin is bad, you know? And so we need to focus on building adaptive systems of learning and not on building new structures to pay lip service to innovation. The second thing we need to do, again, we're in the era of big data and talking about MOOCs finally, massive open online classes. These classes, most people talk about like they're going to revolutionize the world, provide education to every corner of the world. But what I actually want to talk about is not so much their reach, but their richness. What I mean is that the real power in the MOOCs is the fact that with the analytics, it has a self-improvement engine so that we understand what really drives student engagement and learning. For hundreds of years, we've been flying blind. Higher education has been teaching students for hundreds of years without actually recognizing if they're learning. And finally, with MOOCs, user engagement equates to student engagement. Not only vertically, professor to student, but also horizontally, student to student, collaborative working. With machine learning, we're able to develop customized problem sets and curricula for students so that they can learn their best. So we have an engine here where we can improve the service that we're providing to the students, drive a Moore's law of educational improvements for the students while reducing costs. And this is not a replacement to the classroom or a replacement to the faculty, but rather an aid or service that can help us use the classroom more effectively for collaborative work. And finally, the third point is something I've forgotten right now, but I'll bring it up in 1 second, I hope. Oh, yes, the third point is that with the space race, right? It wasn't until the end of the space race that we figured out we have to figure out a new business model for capitalizing on our research. We started the OTL, we started focusing on patents. And what we see today is that we can't affect how much funding is out there, but we can influence where we decide to integrate on the value chain of the research. So you already see lots of universities opening up tech incubators. They kind of move from licensing technology to actually trying to spin off companies. And Stanford is actually really pioneering in the fact that last year they started a venture capital fund called the Stanford VC StartX Fund, which just in the first quarter of 2014 has invested $13 million in 29 Stanford companies. So we're moving from technology licensing to incubators to investing. So what can we do? We're students, we're faculty, we're alumni. We need to get involved in student governments. We need to get our voice heard from the Board of Trustees. You can participate in different committees with the Board of Trustees, with student government. As alumni, we need to vote with our pocketbooks. We shouldn't just dole out money every time the university comes to us with a new, beautiful business project on a piece of paper. We should be giving money because we feel indebted to the university and the value that creates. And if we don't feel that way, we need to change the system. And so I started with a headline, and I'd like to kind of end with a hypothetical headline I hope to see from now. It's that recent IPO earnings from Stanford-backed company provide windfall for university. Stanford immediately announces significant tuition reductions for the years to come. Thank you.